If you are like me, then you plan to write code that never ever has any bugs in it. Unfortunately, those are great plans, but it's not very realistic. Everyone's code has bugs in it. I'm certainly no different, and consequently, debugging our code is one of the most important tasks that we have as a developer. Now, one of the cool things that I think sets Visual Studio Code apart from some simpler, more basic text editors like Notepad++ or Sublime Text is its built-in debugging options. I'd like to show you how to use that today. So to begin, I'm going to start with a simple hello world.py file. If you don't know Python code, don't worry about it. This just asks the user for their name and then prints out hello username. And if you want to debug Python code, Visual Studio Code does need the Python extension enabled. If I come over here, I've got my Python enabled and installed. And you can tell, A, because it's listed over here in my extensions marketplace as being enabled. But also you can tell because when you are looking at the Python file, down here in the lower left, you can see which Python executable, which Python interpreter I am using. It's Python 3.7.4, the 32-bit version. I can always select it and browse for a different Python executable if I would like to set up a different one. We'll just use the one that I have installed. I think it's the only one anyways. So to debug this code, all I need to do is go to debug and say start debugging. Although I also need a breakpoint, or I need to set up some watches. So I'm just going to come over here to this area on the left of the code and click right there on line 3. See that little red dot? That's called a breakpoint. What that means is when this code is running, it is automatically going to stop on that line. So I'll click Start Debugging, and I will choose of my different configuration options the Python file, the currently active Python file. So it launches Python with debugging enabled, and you can see down here in the terminal now it's running. So it's asked what my name is. I will type in Ben. And now I have reached this point in the code. You see it highlighted in yellow with this little arrow here. So my debugger is attached to this hello-world.py file. And I can look over here at all the different variables. For instance, there is the name variable, and I can see its value right now is Ben. I can set up watches on these variables. I can pay attention to the call stack. All of your typical basic debugging options that you would expect in a full-featured IDE are available here, built in, as long as you have the Python extension enabled. So we're going to let this finish running, and that's what it looks like to debug your code inside of Python. Now, this is what we call launch debugging, and that's because Visual Studio Code launched the file for me in debugging mode and attached the debugger to it so that I could have my breakpoint and watch my variables and do all that stuff. But we also have an option to do what's called attach debugging, and we'll take a look at this JavaScript code here to do that. Attach debugging is slightly different. When we attach a debugger, we are attaching to code that is already executing. So in this case, I'm going to open up my command window here, and I'm just going to run node --inspect-brk fib.js. So what's happening here is I am launching this file, this code, this JavaScript code, but I'm telling it to wait for a debugger to attach. That's what the --inspect-brk is. So it's executing this file, but it's waiting. That's what's happening right here. You see debug listening. So I'm going to come back over here. Because I did not launch it through Visual Studio Code, you can see none of my debug is going on in Visual Studio Code. But if I say I want a breakpoint right there where it logs out to the console some information, I can say Control P and attach to node process. You just search for attach. This is built right into Visual Studio Code. Debug attach to node process. When I select that, it's going to take a second to look at the running processes, and it's going to find the different node processes that are running on my program right now. And here's one right here, node inspect break fib.js. That's the one that I just launched. You can tell that that's the one because debug port is 9229. And if I open this up, yep, there's my debug port 9229. So let us attach to that. And here we can see that the debugger has now finished attaching. Notice that I've got it stopped already for me. It didn't even wait to hit my breakpoint. It just stopped on the first line. I've got my control commands up here. I've got my variables and my watch and my call stack. And if I come back here to my prompt, I can see debugger attached. So now the code is executing. And if I let it run, it's going to run all the way to this line, to this breakpoint that I have set up. And I can look at all of the different options. So I can debug my Node.js code even if it wasn't launched through Visual Studio Code, which is important if you are launching code from other processes. Maybe you have another web server or another application that is launching code and you want to debug that. And by the way, you can attach to just about any programming language. Any programming interpreter or compiler is going to have some debug options, but it's different for every language. I'm using Node.js because this is built into Node.js and into Visual Studio Code, but there are debugging options for Python. There's debugging options for C or C++. Every language has some debugging options. You don't have to worry about that. You just need to look up on the internet and find some specific documentation for the language that you're running and how you attach a debugger to it. So that covers using the Visual Studio Code debugger. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.